Okay, that's on. Let's press this one as well, just in case. Although the two people are usually trying to drop. I'm not able to make it today.
As I told her I was doing.
Okay. We're halfway through. How are you feeling? You coping?
We have to have a beta pass, right?
Yes. Yes. But there's a few more points in that second half than the first half on purpose, so that, because that first half, that's tricky for everybody, because unless you've come through an undergrad program where you do a lot of research, this is a brand new skill. So it takes a while. So now we've got some even more fun bit to come, because now you get to find your own research. Okay. Just to quickly run through what's going on for the rest of the semester, we've got 2 more classroom meetings after this, right? And then you've got time to work on your own, on your annotated bibliographies and your presentations, right? So at any point, once we're done with classroom, if you want to make an appointment, just drop me an email through Blackboard, and I can meet with you to talk about annotated bibliographies or research, search terms if you're having trouble in the database, or the presentation ideas, and someone needs to kick me if I forget to open up the directions for the presentation now, because I keep those shut until we're through midterm, because I don't want people working ahead. All right, so if I forget to do that, give me a yell. And then presentations will be the 29th of November and the 6th of December. So in a couple of weeks' time, we'll start talking about sign-up sheets and things for those presentations, because people need to let me know which week they want to be on, what time slot they want, so that we can get everybody in. So I'll make a little grid and I'll put it up on Blackboard so that you can see what's available, first come, first serve on the slots. Okay. So this is pretty brief today, actually, because it's really just a FYI. It isn't something that you specifically have to incorporate in any work that you're doing for this class, although it might make some of your reading a little bit easier. We're going to take a very quick look at part 3 of your textbook. Part 3 is selecting the most appropriate method. So I'm going to just chat very, very briefly about some options for methodology. Historically, until this semester, we have always had a second research class, at which point you would have to create a methodology to collect the data for your purpose statement. Now, those of you who are brand new in the program don't have that class on your degree plan. And I don't know what the department are going to do about that. Technically, I don't think we'd be able to make you take it even if we bring it back. However, we may incorporate something like that into that capstone experience, all right, that you do have on the degree plan instead of a comprehensive exam. So don't just block this out and kind of ignore it, because it may come back and be important for you, all right? And as I said, I think even just a vague kind of overview might help you a little bit with some of your reading, because the methodologies will make more sense to you as you read more papers if you've got an understanding of these different categories of them. So chapter 11 talks about reviewing the literature, right? And the first important thing when you're looking at that is to distinguish between two types of lit reviews, right? The one that you read in the first half of the semester is what we call a systematic literature review. So it's an actual article that is a literature review, right? And I'll come back to that idea in a little bit because there's a couple of different versions of that. The other one is called a traditional lit review, and that's what you would do if you ran a study. All right, so if you run a study, you would do some disciplines do it a little bit differently, but the overall picture is the same. They just may break it up slightly differently. But if you do a thesis or a dissertation or you collect data that is empirical, you're going to have chapter 1, which is your introduction. All right. Chapter 2 is your literature review. Chapter 3 is methodology. Chapter 4 is results. And chapter 5 is discussion. So your purpose statement would go into your introduction. And you would very, very briefly summarize your argument for your study, right? Because the introduction is there to catch the reader, to get them to go, ooh, this sounds cool, let's read some more of this paper, right? Which is why you need to be able to summarize these papers well, okay? Your lit review is your summary of your papers and your development of your argument, right? So your lit review starts out pretty broad, and the goal is by the end of chapter 2, you've funneled your reader down to a point where they understand why this question is interesting and important. Okay? So you have to develop that argument in the lit review. So all your research that you're finding, you would pull together to create that argument in chapter 2. Right? So this is a traditional literature review that you would have to do for a thesis or a dissertation. Okay. Methodology is what we're going to look at today. How are you going to collect the data? Right? So this would have your design, your equipment that you might have to use, any surveys or questionnaires that you were going to use. You would tell your reader at the end of the methodology how you were going to analyze your data. All right? And then chapter 4 is, this is the results from the analysis. So, depending on whether it's quantitative or qualitative, this could be a load of numbers and tables and graphs, or it could be interview, a qualitative interview chunks. You know, this is what someone said. These are the themes that we developed based on what they said, right? On that qualitative idea. And then chapter 5, I think, is always the most fun. Chapter 5, you get to talk about your results. Why do you think you found them? Why are they important? What do they mean? What are the implications of the results? How might these results be used by people? And you would put your conclusion statement into that discussion. Right? So, that's if you're going to do the whole paper, a full study, right? If I'm going to convert this into an article, then sometimes you'll see a subheading introduction. That's usually a combination of chapters 1 and 2. Right? You'll get methodology or procedures. Doesn't matter whether it's quantitative or qualitative, they're going to tell you what they did, because the whole point is you have to be able to replicate it. Right? So they have to give you exactly what they did, so that if you wanted to, you could run the same study. Okay. You see a results section, and sometimes you'll see a discussion or a synthesis or conclusion, depends on the journal that you're looking at. So you see these sections in a journal article, they're just not as explicit and as deeply covered as they would be in a thesis or a dissertation. So, traditional literature review then is chapter 2. It's not a study, right? It is part of explaining why your study is important. Okay? So let's see. The systematic lit review would be like the thing that you read, okay? And an article that is a lit review is summarizing the existing data and literature in that particular topic. So they're very useful articles to get your hands on, particularly if you can find one that is current, because they will give you a summary of what's already out there, and then you can go and find what's out there and write your own lit review, right? So they can be very, very useful articles to get your hands on. And they, as I said, they evaluate the current position on the topic, right? Now, sometimes they actually analyze the position on the topic. So you might see a lit review where they say, we did a meta-analysis. So when they do a meta-analysis, they take several different papers that have data in them, and they pool that data. So I could find maybe 6 or 7 different papers that have motor skill data on preschool children, right? I can pool all that data into one big set, and then I can reanalyze it as one big set. Right? So I don't actually go and get the data, I collect everybody else's data and do a meta-analysis, and so I say, okay, based on the current literature out there and my analysis, this is where we currently stand. Right? So they might just literally summarize the data, or they may reanalyze the data. There is a qualitative equivalent of a meta-analysis that is called a meta-synthesis. And that's theme-based, and I can't tell you diddly squish about that. If you want to know about meta-synthesis, or you find one and you want to know how to use it, you're going to have to contact Dr. Berkey, because I have no clue. But I would suspect that they're similar in that they're going to have a really great reference page. that is very useful. Okay? You would still see an introduction and a methodology even if it's a literature review, because they still have to tell you what they did to get to the discussion and the conclusion, right? So sometimes, depending upon the journal that they're publishing the review in, they may actually tell you, I went to PubMed, I went to XYZ different databases, and these are the search terms I put in, and this is how many papers came back, and then on those papers I looked for this particular word, and that narrowed it down to X number of papers, right? They'll actually tell. They don't always do that. The one that we read didn't tell us that. It just said that this is the kind of information that's out there, right? They didn't give us that detailed a breakdown of how they found those papers. But you will still see those rough sections, even if it's a lit review article, not an empirical article. Okay. Does that make sense? Right. So then moving on to chapter 12. Chapter 12 looks at, she says, where am I? That's the wrong book, Sarah. That doesn't help, does it? Put the keys on there. It's been a long day. Chapter 12 is looking at experimental research methods in phys ed and sport. So it's really looking at quantitative methodologies, not qualitative. All right, we get to qualitative later on. So chapter 12 looks at experimental designs and talks about quasi-experimental. Remember that if it's a quantitative study, what we're looking for is a cause-effect relationship. We want to be able to predict something based upon doing a particular intervention. So it may be a training program, it may be a drug, it may be a different pair of shoes, right? And we are going to see an independent variable and a dependent variable, at least one of each, often more, right? You guys, we've tried to damp you down to one of each, but when you read studies, there's frequently more than one. And we're looking at some kind of manipulation, so the intervention, or a manipulation of the drug, or a manipulation of the shoes, right? Often, preferably, there'll be a control group, and if it's going to be really gold standard experimental research, there'd be randomized assignment, right? We talked about the fact that that's very hard to pull off, and often we use a convenience sample. If it's a convenient sample, then somewhere they're likely to state that it was a quasi-experimental study. Because a convenient sample is a little bit of a letdown, but often it's the only way forward. So quasi-experimental doesn't mean it's bad. It just means that it's not quite gold standard. Right? If there's a manipulation, then a lot of the time you're going to see some version of a pre-test and post-test, or you might have a pre-test and a mid-test and a post-test. Okay. If you have a look at page 153, in here they have a very nice little flowchart diagram that shows you the setup for pre-test, post-test design. So again, we had talked about a while back that, you know, if you do a quantitative study, a lot of the work is in setting up the study, designing it properly, finding good participants, making sure that you've accounted for as many limitations as you can, keeping it as tight as possible. If you do a qualitative study, it's quite flexible and fluid at the beginning of the study, but there's lots and lots of work to do on the results, which you don't have so much work on a quantitative. You plug those numbers in, you choose the analysis that is appropriate, and you run the statistics. There's not a lot to do. Right? Setting it up is the key so that those numbers, when they spew out at the end, are actually useful. And someone can't turn around and go, well, you forgot to think about this, and then the whole thing's shot to pieces. In quantitative work and experimental work, you're often going to see the authors talk about internal and external validity. The terminology tends to change a little bit depending which textbook you look at. Internal validity is that everything was as tight as possible. The people who were who they said they were. I've got internal validity. I controlled everything within the study. Right? Construct validity means, does the thing I'm using to measure, so for example, if I use a questionnaire that says it is going to give me an idea how people perceive 3D, right? I'm making it up, I don't know, right? Then construct validity means that that tool actually does what it says it's going to do. Because you have to make a bit of an assumption about that. So when you use a piece of equipment or you use any kind of questionnaires or surveys, you want to look into the research and the literature as much as you can and see if anybody has given you the thumbs up on external or construct validity. And then external validity is can I generalize the results? What can I do with the results once I've found them? Right? Okay. Chapter 13 I'm not going to talk about today, but if you want to measure physical activity, then you want to take a look at chapter 13. They talk about pedometers, accelerometers, and different techniques for measuring physical activity in people. So if that's your area of interest, and I know it is for a couple of you because the purpose statements clearly talk about physical activity levels, then you might want to check out chapter 13 and just see what kind of tools are out there that would be acceptable if you wanted to publish your work. Okay? And then chapter 14 is looking at things you have to pay attention to if you want to do a survey. Okay. So surveys are used if you want to describe and analyze, if I want to analyze a certain behavior or a particular opinion or perception that people might have, I can use a survey. And I'll get numbers out. It's going to be probably quantitative, right? Because if it's not quantitative and it's qualitative, it probably wasn't a survey, it was more of an interview. Right? So if it's a survey, then the key to a good survey or a good questionnaire is good questions, right? If you cannot find a validated questionnaire or survey that asks what it is you want to know, and you have to create your own, you're going to have to run a pilot study. Because you have to check that the questions get at what you wanted them to get at, right? That other people interpret your questions and give answers that are actually what you're looking for, and that they don't read it and think it meant something different. Right? So you have to check your questions if you're going to create your own. So it's very helpful if you can find one that's out there that's already validated. Right? So if you're doing a survey type thing, it should identify an independent, you should still be able to use a survey to examine an independent and dependent variable. The other thing about surveys that you have to make a decision on if you're going to use one is it going to be self-administered? So am I going to mail the survey out to hundreds of people, right, and let them fill it in and mail it back to me? Or am I going to call them up and give them the survey over the phone and write down their answers? Right? So it could be kind of an interview, but you're giving them the survey, or it could be self-administered, which is a lot of people do that in sport and PE. The problem with self-administered ones is that you get a very low return rate. So you literally have to send out hundreds and hundreds, and if you're lucky, you'll get back 35 or 40. And there's a cost involved because you can't expect them to mail it back at their cost, so you have to send stamped addressed envelopes so that they can send it back to you, right? Or you've got to do it through email and hope they remember to email you back. When you're looking for surveys, make sure they're robust, make sure that they've got some validity. If you can, as I said, it's time-consuming to have to write your own if you can't find one. And then the last chapter that's looking at quantitative type methodologies is chapter 15, and chapter 15 looks at observational studies. Right? So I can sit at the edge of the playground and I can literally count how many times one of the girls sat down in the sand and started playing a food game instead of running around on the playground. Right? That would be an observational study. I would end up with quantitative data because I would be counting how many times she did it, or I would be timing how long she was sitting down for versus how long she was running around, right? That would be observational, and it would be considered non-participatory. I didn't join in the playing, I was purely on the outside. You can do observational data and be in the game and be cooperating as part of the observation. You can get quantitative or qualitative data depending on what it is you're recording. Okay. So you can use observational data in either type, but we can use it. People tend to forget that you can use observational data as a quantitative design as well as a methodology as well as a qualitative one. The nice thing about observational data, and I've only ever done one study that was purely observational, The nice thing is that picture that you create from that data is truly authentic, right? This is really what happened in this point in time in this context, which can be very useful depending on what your question is, right? It all depends on what am I interested in, what is my question, what am I trying to find out about. So for me as a developmental person, that authenticity is very important because it's easy to misrepresent what is happening. If I just look at heart rate data, then heart rate can go up for all number of reasons. It didn't necessarily mean they were running fast on the playground. They might have been having a fight with the teacher. Okay? If I wasn't there watching it and recording it, I don't really know. Okay? One of the downsides to observational data is that it's often very time consuming because you have to sit there and watch it or film it. You can video it, but then you have to go back and you have to look at your notes or you have to look at the video and you have to transcribe what you saw into a table or, right? So it adds an extra step quite often, but it gives you a very interesting picture of what was really going on. So again, it depends on the question. You might have a checklist, right? You might say, okay, I'm seeing hopping right now on that part of the playground, but I never saw hopping over on this part of the playground. So maybe if I'm interested in playground design, why do they hop over there and not over here? If it's a hot day, maybe it's shady over there. And the shade is important to influencing that behavior. Right? The questions you can come up with are only as narrow as your imagination. Right? You can create any questions by looking at anything. That's what I love about it. Even stuff I have absolutely no knowledge about, you can still look at something and go, oh, I wonder what if, right? I'm not going to follow up on it because it's not actually in my interest, but it kind of becomes part of your self-speak if you get into this. You just find yourself doing it all the time. Okay, and so then they give you a couple of chapters that are really qualitative methodologies. The first one is on case study. None of you that I can think of have a purpose that would be directly case study right now, but there is a chapter there that helps you think through what's important if I want to do a case study. Why would we do a case study? Right? For me as a quantitative person, that's one of my first questions. Why would you study one person? It doesn't tell you anything about the picture. But for some people, what that one person does is important. Right? Depends on what you're looking for. And then there's a chapter on interviews and focus groups. So Dr. Berkey mentioned this when she did her talk on qualitative research. All right, an interview can be one-on-one, and it would be in-depth information, right? The questions that I'm going to ask in a one-to-one interview become really important. It could be a focus group. So I might have a group of people in the room at one time, and we're all talking and I'm guiding the conversation, or I'm picking up on what someone's saying. So interviews and focus groups can be very structured. I can make sure that we ask these questions, or they can be a little more fluid. They can be somewhat unstructured, where the next question builds on what came out of the answer to the previous question. I would never want to do that. That's too tricky for me. I like to have things planned, right? Dr. Burke is very good at those interview techniques. So if you end up with a question that looks like it would be qualitative and you want to collect that, you want to make sure to talk to her. Right? Because there are different ways of approaching that. And then further in the book, they have a whole chapter on that grounded theory that came up in one of the articles we read. So if you were wondering about grounded theory and wanted a little more background on that, there is a chapter in there that gives you some information on grounded theory. It's based in a sociology background, and if you're using grounded theory, you collect your data and then you develop the theory, right? It's a reflective experience rather than a planning experience. So it's a very, very different way of approaching data collection and answering a question. It's much more concerned with patterns of things than it is with answering a question or discovering a relationship between two things, right? So it's not less valuable, it's just very different, and it all depends upon what your question is. Okay. So, some of you, I'm not sure, have been reading your textbook. Read your textbook, there's lots of really good information there. It will help you out, it will help you understand what you're reading. Alright? Research can be tricky to read if you don't know what you're looking for or you don't understand the rules that are governing the article that you're reading. Alright? So use the resources to help you get a better foundation of what goes on in research, because that will make reading it much more straightforward and less overwhelming, and therefore less stressful and a little more fun, which is what we're all about, right? Gotta have fun. Okay? So that's it for today. As I said, 2 more weeks. Next week, we are going to look at quantitative analysis, so we'll be looking at some stats. I'm not going to do qualitative analysis because I don't know enough about it, but there are lots of resources loaded on Blackboard to help you with qualitative analysis, if that's what you want to do as you move forwards. All right? So it will make your life much easier next week if you go to Blackboard and you download, there's a couple of charts there, and there's a cheat sheet. Bring them to class. It'll make everything a lot simpler. Okay? All right. Have a good evening. Go enjoy the sunshine.